Hey guys, Mr. Cotter here. Today I want to talk about some major changes in the American economy after the Civil War that transformed how people lived and paved the way for both big business and the progressive movement. Since the beginning of agriculture 10,000 years ago, the vast majority of people have always been farmers, with only a small percentage of people working in trade and manufacturing. Before the Civil War, the United States was no different. If you had lived back then, you almost certainly would have lived and worked on a farm. Much of what you owned would have been made by you or a family member at home, and almost everything you purchased would have been made by a local craftsperson in your hometown. That began to change in earnest after the Civil War, when a combination of technological advances and improvements in transportation conspired to turn the United States into the world's first ever corporate capitalist economy. By 1900, the American economy was dominated by large, multi-million-dollar corporations, and the average consumer could order pretty much any household good from a Sears catalog and have it delivered to their door. For the first time, a majority of Americans came to be employed in manufacturing or in the service industry, as industrial manufacturers became the nation's largest employers. As a result of this transformation, by 1914, the American economy had grown to be 8 times the size it had been during the Civil War. At the same time, many Americans grew concerned that large corporations and their millionaire shareholders exerted too much control on American politics and society. The catalyst for the economic transformation after the Civil War was the railroad. Although the United States, especially the Northeast, had had extensive railroad networks before the Civil War, that was child's play compared to the amount of track that was constructed after the war. Between 1865 and 1900, the railroad companies built over 175,000 miles of railroad track, over 5 times the amount that existed at the time of the Civil War. The government spurred this railroad construction boom by giving railroad companies huge stretches of land out west on which to build their tracks. This amounted to a handout worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the railroad corporations. The government knew that it would revolutionize the economy to connect the mineral and resource-rich West to the densely populated eastern states. In 1862, during the Civil War, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act, which gave huge swaths of land to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads with the intent that they complete the first ever transcontinental railroad. The Union Pacific worked westward from Nebraska, relying on the labor of Irish and other immigrants. The Central Pacific worked eastward from Central California, relying almost exclusively on the labor of recent Chinese immigrants. In 1869, after 7 years of frenzied drilling through the Rocky Mountains, the two railroads met in Utah. Quick and convenient land travel from coast to coast was finally possible, and the country would never be the same. The railroads changed America in a few profound ways. First, they encouraged the growth of industry. By connecting different areas of the country, the railroads allowed successful manufacturers to reach more customers than ever before. For example, rather than there being thousands of different small shoemakers across the country, now one industrial shoemaker in Massachusetts could sell millions of shoes to people in every corner of the United States. The same thing happened in every industry, as a handful of successful manufacturers began to serve the entire country, displacing the thousands of small artisans who formerly made goods just for their neighbors. Second, the people who owned the railroads became phenomenally wealthy as larger railroads swallowed up small ones and received millions of dollars in government assistance. Beginning in the 1860s, certain railroad companies began to buy out their competitors and form new integrated railroads that could, for example, provide direct service from New York to Chicago and beyond. Because of the efficiency of having a single company manage thousands of miles of track, the larger railroad companies could lower the price for their tickets, which undercut their competition and allowed them to grow even bigger. This practice was known as railroad consolidation. The most successful railroad consolidator was Cornelius Vanderbilt, who became one of the richest men in America by buying up several competing railroads in New York State. As state and federal governments continued to pour millions of dollars into the railroad companies in the form of direct assistance and land grants, railroad owners began to bribe government officials with the hope of securing special treatment. This gave rise to the image of railroad owners as robber barons, rich capitalists who made their money not through hard work, but through corrupt manipulation of the government. Members of Congress frequently owned stock in railroad companies, and they often used their influence to enrich themselves. One notable event of corruption was called the Crédit Mobilier scandal. In 1872, a congressman who also owned a stake in the Union Pacific Railroad sold stock for less than it was worth to other congressmen in an attempt to get additional land grants for the company. Although it worked in the short run, word of the deal got out and it further tarnished the reputation of both congressmen and railroad owners in the eyes of the public. As the first major corporations, railroads both increased the material wealth of the United States and caused corruption and inequality. As the railroads connected distant markets, other big businesses emerged to take advantage of new opportunities for wealth. These businesses were organized as corporations, which allowed them to sell stock and to raise money. By selling stock, these new corporations could raise enough money to build massive high-tech factories that would allow them to produce goods for much cheaper than traditional small artisans. Before long, large corporations came to replace small manufacturers in almost every segment of the economy. These large corporations changed the nature of production by practicing vertical integration. Vertical integration is the practice of a corporation buying up its suppliers and its distributors in order to be able to lower prices and increase its market share. Andrew Carnegie, who began manufacturing steel in Pittsburgh in 1875, was a pioneer in vertical integration. Carnegie was a very successful steel manufacturer because he used a new production technique developed in England, known as the Bessemer process. With his profits, he purchased the iron mines that he used to buy his raw materials from, and he also purchased the distributors that he used to pay to ship his steel to market. By bringing the entire chain of production, from mining to distribution, under a single company, he was able to lower prices and beat out his competitors. Carnegie and other industrialists used vertical integration to create the largest and most efficient manufacturing enterprises ever known. Another new practice of industrial corporations was known as horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is the practice of a company buying up its competitors in order to reduce competition. This practice was pioneered by oil tycoon J.D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller had gotten extremely wealthy building oil refineries to process crude oil into kerosene and later gasoline. After spending the 1870s buying up competitors, by 1880 Rockefeller controlled about 90% of the U.S. oil refining industry. Whereas vertical integration, as practiced by Carnegie's steel company, allowed a business to lower prices for the benefit of the consumer, horizontal integration, as practiced by Rockefeller, allowed a business to raise prices, since there was no longer any meaningful competition. When a company becomes the only player in a given market, it is known as a monopoly. Rockefeller's monopoly in the oil business concerned many people who feared his ability to set oil prices. Through horizontal integration, J.D. Rockefeller became quite literally the richest man in the history of the world. The public's concern over the influence of such rich and powerful businessmen would be a driving force behind the coming progressive movement and the new push for government regulation of big business. The period after the Civil War was characterized not only by large corporations, but also by a variety of new inventions that are with us to this day. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. The next year, Thomas Edison invented the record player. By 1900, the light bulb, gas-powered car, and handheld camera had all also been brought to market. In 1886, Sears Roebuck & Company began the famous Sears catalog, which promised to ship any new consumer good to anyone in the United States who mailed in a simple check. Together, the railroad, the large corporations, and new consumer goods transformed the life of the average American into something much more familiar to us today than was the world of the Civil War. The challenges of this new corporate economy would be the driving force behind the progressive movement. As people began to realize the power of the new industrialists and witness the atrocious working conditions of their employees, many people would look to government as a counterbalance to the power of business. Much of the rest of the year will involve the study of how people tried to grapple with the challenges posed by the new industrial economy. All right, thanks guys. See you in class.